All right, this is example number 2 of how to critique a research article for critique number 2 for the research course. So in this case, we have an article published in PLS 1, and that is, does work-induced fatigue accumulate across 3 compressed 12-hour shifts in hospital nurses and aides? So let's just go down to the bottom of the introduction. And what we get is this sentence here. Thus, the purpose of the present investigation was to examine the effects of a single nursing work shift versus 3 successive 12-hour shifts on performance-based fatigue in nurses and aides using vigilance-based reaction time, lapses of attention, and muscle function assessments as objective performance measures. Okay, so that is a pretty decent little research question. It includes study factor, it includes the response variable, and then also includes the population of interest, and it's even nice enough to tell us a little bit about how the response variable is going to be measured. So let's take a look at it. The effects of a single nursing work shift versus 3 successive work shifts. So the study factor is going to be shifts, or the number of shifts, 1 versus 3 in a row. Now, let's just be clear. Let's go to the next part. So the next part is on the performance-based fatigue. So performance-based fatigue, this is the response variable. Now, to be clear, anything that affects or could affect performance-based fatigue is a factor. So factors are going to affect something else. So the factors are going to affect performance-based fatigue, or possibly affect it. Now, if we are interested in that particular factor, we call it the study factor. So in this case, the one that we're interested in is 1 12-hour shift versus 3 12-hour shifts. There's some other things that could affect performance-based fatigue, like how tired you were that day to begin with, how much you slept that night, how old you are, your gender. So there's all sorts of things that could affect performance-based fatigue, but the one that we are interested in this case is 1 shift versus 3 shifts. So that's our study factor. So the response variable is going to be performance-based fatigue. And then they tell us a little bit about they're going to use vigilance-based reaction times, lapses of attention, and muscle function assessments. So they're telling us a little bit about how they're going to measure that performance-based fatigue. And then it says in nurses and aides. Now, if you scroll back up to the very top, it says hospital nurses and aides. So going by the title of the article and by what's stated in the introduction, we can assume that we're not talking about aides in the community or nurses in the community, or maybe not even nursing home, but actual hospital. So what you might commonly consider staff nurses. Okay, so now we're going to look at each of those components in a little bit more detail. So first, we're going to look at the study participants, the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So they're going to tell us that they use a convenient sampling technique to recruit nurses who are employed at local hospitals. Okay, that's fine. And the way that they did that was advertisements, flyers, and word of mouth. So people who are interested in participating were then pre-screened according to eligibility criteria. So that'd be your inclusion-exclusion criteria. So here we go. Eligibility criteria. Number 1, current registered nurse or LPN or CNA. Number 2, they had to be working full-time, which is defined as at least 36 hours per week, and they needed to be 12-hour shift employees. So if you're an 8-hour shift employee, then that didn't matter. And then they also had to be between the ages of 18 and 65. And in addition, participants were required to be free of neuromuscular disorders, such as, and they give you a list of things. So that would be an exclusion criteria. Had no previous musculoskeletal injuries or surgeries on their dominant leg in the past 1 year, and could not be pregnant. Okay, so this might sound a little odd. They could not be pregnant. Not necessarily sure about what that one is, but this one, no previous musculoskeletal injuries or surgery on their dominant leg within the previous year, is because they're going to be measuring strength in that leg. And so that's why they're doing that. Now, is that good or bad? Well, it's not the greatest, but it's understandable in that they're trying to do a strength assessment. And if you have something that causes weakness already, then that could be a problem. And then the same thing with neuromuscular disorders. Now, as far as the rest of those, if what you're looking for is people who are working 12-hour shifts, well, they've got to be working 12-hour shifts, so that makes sense. Between the ages of 18 and 65, well, I guess they're just trying to do an ordinary working adult. And then they have to be working full time. Okay, so all those seem pretty reasonable. So in terms of critiquing the inclusion-exclusion criteria, that's kind of how you would think about that. Then as far as critiquing the study sample, well, they just come right out and tell you that it's a convenient sample, but it's not enough to just say it's a convenient sample. What we always want to try and do is describe the sampling method. So in this case, the sampling method is they used advertisements and flyers and word of mouth to advertise to local area hospital nurses. And that's pretty much it. That's a nice little one-sentence description of what they did. And then you're going to classify that, and they already helped you out, as a convenience sample. Now, the final result of critiquing the inclusion-exclusion and the study sample is to make an assumption about how well are the people who are studied in this particular study going to be representative of nurses as a whole. And in this case, you can also see that they didn't get that many of them. They got 26 nurses and aides. So, and they ranged from 18 to 62. So that is a really big range. Of course, that's kind of representative of what nurses are, but with only 26 of them to begin with, are going to be able to make meaningful conclusions about nurses in general. All right, so the next thing is the response variables. So let's come down to the response variables, and we get assessments and measures. And they're actually going to tell us what these are. So reaction time. And they're going to use the psychomotor vigilance task called the PVT. And they describe what that is. And the PVT variables include mean and slowest 10% reaction times, as well as the number of minor lapses, which is defined as a response time of this. So basically, this is a sort of like a computer game, I guess, that asks them to pay attention to something. And when they don't pay attention quick enough, well, they count the number of the times they don't pay attention enough. And those are called lapses, or in this case, minor lapses. Then they also did vertical jump, which is a measure of power. Power is the ability to display strength quickly over time. So, for example, if you can lift a 500-pound weight, that would be a raw strength. Now, if you can lift it in 5 seconds, where someone else could only lift it in 10 seconds, then the person who could lift it in 5 seconds would be more powerful, even if they're not necessarily stronger. So, power is the ability to generate force very quickly. And vertical jump is a good way to do that. And then they did various strength assessments, and they followed the blah, blah isometric strength assessment, and then were performed on the knee extensor, knee flexor, and wrist flexor, which is hand strength. So what they were doing there is they were measuring how strong a person's knee was, extending and flexing, and then also did grip strength. So all of these measures are numerical. The reaction time, because they're counting the number of lapses, could be considered possibly discrete, or it could be considered continuous, although you can't have half a lapse. It's whole numbers only. Vertical jump and strength assessments are very clearly going to be continuous measures. Now, as far as are these good ways to measure it, they do provide quite a bit of detail as to how they did it. And they also mention a few times, they do some citations here of why they chose these particular things. And I think in one of those, they actually said that it was reliable. So when you're talking about the appropriateness of the response variable, you are going to have to, based on what they say and what they present to you in the article, make an assessment of whether you think that is an appropriate way to assess or to measure the response variable, which in this case is going to be performance-based fatigue. All right, next we have the study factors. Now, the study factors, in this case, there's only one study factor, and that is going to be the number of shifts, either 1 or 3 shifts. So if we come up to experimental procedures, what we can see here is that they measured people before their first shift. And then, see here, the second visit was a pretest and was scheduled within 24 hours of the first work shift, but 48 hours after any previous shifts. So they're going to measure them before they do a 12-hour shift. Then they're going to measure them after the first 12-hour shift. And then they're going to measure them after a third shift in a row. So they're measuring them before, 1 shift, and 3 shifts. So that's how they're controlling for the study factor. All right, now as far as the design of the study goes in here, it's definitely prospective because the data has not yet been collected. So they're identifying people, then they're explaining them what's going to happen, then they bring them in for a baseline and collect that data, and they bring them back after 1 shift and bring them back again after 3 shifts. So that's very clearly very clearly prospective. And so that gives us 2 possibilities. It's either observational or it is clinical trial. Now, in this case, everyone had the exact same intervention, which is they're going to work 1 shift and then they're going to work 3 shifts. Each person is serving as their own control. So before and after 1, after 2. So they actually control with no shift, control after 1 shift, and then the guess you might want to call it treatment group is after 3 shifts. However, because everyone did the same thing and no one did anything different, and occasionally they probably work 3 shifts in a row, it might be considered more of an observational study than a clinical trial. However, there is a control and every person serving as their own control, so you might consider it a clinical trial, although not necessarily a very strong one. Because there's some potential for either way, you're going to have to make the case for why you think it is the way you think it is. Next, the statistics. So in this case, they give us a little section called statistical analysis where they tell us what they did. So the first thing they did was they used repeated measures of variance called ANOVA. ANOVA is basically a way of testing multiple groups at the same time when there is a continuous or numerical response variable. Now, because all of the response variables were numerical, it makes a lot of sense. And they had 3 measurements before, after 1 shift, and then after 3 shifts. It makes sense that they would use some sort of multiple comparison. So the nice thing about an ANOVA is it's one test that does multiple groups comparisons. The problem is, once you've done the comparisons, if there is a significant difference, it won't let you know which of the groups was different from the others. So what you have to do then is what's called pairwise. So in this case, they've got, so let's say up here at the top of the pyramid, they've got number 1, then they've got number 2, and then number 3. So you have 1, 2, 3 potential relationships. So if you're comparing baseline to number 1, that would be the first pair. Or if you measured number 1 to number 3, that would be another pair. And then if you measured number 3 to number 2, that would be a third pair. So those would be called your pairwise comparisons. Now, they also tell you that there is an alpha level of 0.05. Now, 0.05 alpha level means that you're basically accepting a 5% chance of being wrong, performing a type 1 error. So the problem with that is that if you're performing multiple tests, each of which have a 5% chance of being wrong, the chances of any one of them being wrong goes up dramatically. So in this case, they're doing 3 different response variables, and then one of those response variables had 3 different measuring locations. So they're doing at least 5 different response variables. And so they're doing 3 pairwise tests per group, which means that they're going to be doing 3 times 5, 15 different pairwise groups plus the ANOVAs. So that, if you do 18 flips of a coin at 5% error, what are the chances that any one of those is going to be wrong just by chance? So to make things a little bit more rigorous, they're going to use what's called a Bonferroni adjustment. So basically, they're going to divide 0.05 by the number of statistical tests they're performing, in this case, somewhere between 15 to 18, depending on how they're counting it. So that is a nice little sign. Anytime you see someone talk about Bonferroni, you know that they are being a little bit more rigorous than they otherwise would. The other thing that they did is they did Cohen-D statistics. Now, we have not talked about these, but these are what's called an effect size, and they actually tell you right there effect size. So I don't necessarily expect you to be able to interpret this at this level, but it is nice to be able to see, oh, that's what they're doing there. All right, now the last thing we need to talk about in the results section is the actual results. So in this case, you're going to summarize how they talked about the results. So they gave you some general statistics here. So they're telling you just some summary data. Then they tell you the results of all of the different study variables, of the response variables. And they also show them to you in a nice graphical format. So in this case, this is the standard deviation going up and down, and this is the actual dot. And they're doing it as though it's a dose response curve. So you can see that the dose response is going up or the dose response is going down, depending on what's being measured. So in this case, going down. And then sometimes you'll see it goes slightly up or straight across and then down. So after all of those things, they tell you what the results are. And so let's just take a look at one of the results. So right here, figure 1 shows the blah, 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 blah. There was a main effect for trial time, which is p is less than 0.02 for the number of lapses of attention. So basically they're saying among the 3 groups, there was a significant difference between the groups. However, when we did post hoc comparisons, post had a greater number of lapses compared to pre, whereas mid had blah, 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 blah. And so what they're telling you is that first we said, is there a difference at all? And then when we did the pairwise comparison, we saw there was a difference of this one to that one, but not that one to this one. So when you do your critique, you need to summarize. You don't have to do all of them, but you need to summarize the main result findings of the study. All right, and then after that, everything else is pretty self-explanatory in terms of what you need to do for the critique. So we're going to stop this particular critique there, and let me know if you have any questions. Really, the goal of this is to be more thinking than talking. A lot of you write far too many things, but you don't actually answer the question. So concentrate on the question. What is the response variable? How is it measured? What is it classified as? So in this case, the response variable is performance-based fatigue. How is it measured? Well, it's measured in 3 different ways. So lapses in judgment, strength, and then also vertical jump power. So those are the 3 ways that we're measuring it. When we measure strength, we're going to measure strength at 3 different points. So all of those measurements are continuous variables. See, you don't have to do a lot. You just have to answer the question. So what is the time perspective of the trial, of the study, and what is it? Well, it's prospective. It has some aspects of an observational and some of a clinical trial, and then I'm choosing to call it this because of that. You don't have to say a lot of words. You just have to be meaningful.